Okay, we're here at the John Dickinson Plantation. We're south of Dover, near the Dover Air Force Base, and we're at the boyhood home of John Dickinson. John Dickinson grew up here on this plantation from about the age of 8 to 18. And this is where he was tutored here. He eventually went off to England and studied law and came back here. But by the 1760s, his father had died, and this became a tenant house. So he had various families live here over time, and he also had enslaved individuals. John owned at least 55 enslaved individuals until he freed or manumitted them in 1786. And he also had tradesmen, craftsmen, and indentured servants all living and working in this area. This is a Georgian house, and outside the house is a Flemish bond, which is a charred header, stretcher, charred header, and alternating rows. The house is set up with public rooms such as a parlor, which we're in now. We have a book room, we have a small parlor. Above stairs, we have private bedchambers. We have, and then on the third floor, before the house caught on fire in 1804, there were additional chambers. And now on the third floor, we just have an attic space. John Dickinson is one of our founding fathers. And unfortunately, he's not as well known as we'd like him to be. He was involved in almost every major political activity going on at the time of the Revolutionary War. But because he didn't do one particular thing, he kind of got lost a little in history. And the one thing he didn't do was sign the Declaration of Independence. John really did believe that we could have independence, but possibly the timing wasn't correct and wasn't right. And so he did actually abstain from voting and allowed the vote to go through unanimously. But he actually did pick up a gun and fight in the war. John Dickinson was an absentee farmer. He was a politician. He was a lawyer. He was a man of many talents. And the one talent that he had was a politician, along with being a really prolific writer. He was also considered the penman of the Revolution, based on all the documents and papers that he wrote during the time of the Revolutionary War. Originally, Delaware was considered the lower three counties of Pennsylvania. And John Dickinson was elected governor of Delaware, and then the following year he was elected governor of Pennsylvania. And so he was involved politically in both of the Delaware and Pennsylvania. But yes, he was involved in training the militia and making sure that they were established. We were just going to go to war against England at the time. And John was aware that, of course, England was a great power at the time, and we were going to go against them. And we weren't exactly united during that time. And so he did realize that you would have needed a strong force to go against them. John Dickinson died in 1808, and he was 75 years old. He was ill shortly before he died. He took to his bed and he passed away. And that is when Thomas Jefferson referred to John as a great worthy. And John Dickinson legacy remains today. When we talk about John Dickinson, we not only talk here on the plantation, we talk about the people who also lived here and worked with him and knew him and interacted with John Dickinson.
In 1782, John Dickinson prepared a manual to aid in the training of Delaware's militia. Chuck Fithian, curator of archaeology with the state of Delaware, studied this manual and shared his findings with the Friends of the John Dickinson Mansion.
This project kind of started by having an interest in Dickinson, but also having an interest in 18th century warfare, particularly the common soldier in the ranks, military tactics, and then specifically the soldiers of the American Revolution, be they militia or continental. So the two things kind of began to converge. And they did that one day as I was reading some material on him, and in one of his letters, he makes a reference to one of his brigadiers general that he hopes he had received his copies of Steuben's abstract. And that really piqued my curiosity. You know, we all know who General von Steuben was, but what exactly was he talking about? Had he devised something? Was this something else? And I wasn't familiar with it, and he didn't elaborate on it later. So that set me onto the path of beginning to look. And I was actually looking at some records that date to the early national period in 1790s. And I was turning through some pages and came to the back section of a folder, and there were two little pamphlets. And written across the top is for the use of the militia of the Delaware State, an abstract of von Steuben's regulations for the Army of the United States. So all of a sudden the two things began to come together, and I figured out. So that set me to looking like, what was he doing? What did he face? why he had to produce this, and sort of the circumstances behind it. So that's kind of what I'd like to share with you tonight. It's been it's a road I'm still on, and I'm still learning a lot about him and what he was facing at the time. Mr. Dickinson faced a state that had been ravaged by the war. Even though there had been very few military engagements within its borders, Delaware was suffering greatly. Its economy was in shambles. Civil unrest was prominent. Loyalist uprisings had taken place at least on 2 occasions, and he was inheriting a state that was very much in trouble. And he, classic to his energy and his personality, he set about solving all of this. During the course of very few months, he had an active correspondence with Continental Army officers. He tried to straighten out the pay arrearages that the Delaware Regiment was experiencing. Many of these men were not clothed, armed, or fed properly. He tried to straighten that out. He had to deal with a militia system that was falling apart, and he had to deal with all the economic issues. So these were just a few of the things that he was beginning to face. Very quickly in office, he wrote a militia law that would be somewhat formative in many aspects that he advocated, as well as addressing other military concerns. It was during this time that he apparently began to feel that he needed to produce something that would be useful for the militia, but that would be something where they could function with their Continental Army counterparts. And those 2 worlds would be very distinct, as you'll see here shortly. The Delaware was facing a combination of threats at the beginning of 1782. And in sort of American popular culture, we tend to think, well, Yorktown has occurred. Cornwallis and the British Army that was captured there, they're not here. So where's the problem? And well, that problem rests in several areas. Don't forget, there's 2 more British armies in North America. There's one in New York and one in Canada. And the British easily could have mounted them and undertaken another campaign. So what Dickinson apparently did is he sat down with the von Steuben exercise. He apparently had a copy. Unfortunately, it's not in any of his libraries that we know of now, but he obviously had a copy, and he extracted out of it a system that he considered concise, easy, and efficient for his men to learn. Continental infantryman was required to learn some really complex things. And what Dickinson does is he takes this rather long manual and scales it down to a little pamphlet that's roughly about 7 by 4 inches, perfect to sit in somebody's waistcoat pocket, and 38 pages long. And each section determines what he considers to be significant. The first part that he describes, the first of the chapters, is basic company and regimental formations. They are the basic ingredient for any military organization to be able to function. Those are sort of the core nucleus of it. And if the men do not understand how to work within either company exercise or regimental formations, then they're not going to be successful at it. So those are the 2 things that, as far as the basic military organizations goes, and as it reflected the organization of the militia that he wanted them to begin to understand. Then that becomes the individual performance of the Manual of Arms itself. Now I'm showing you a few illustrations. The manual was not illustrated until 1798. So all of this is being written down, it's being in print by him, and it's being then transferred to the non-commissioned officers who are then physically going out and doing it. That's the basic position. And then you come to the manual exercise itself. To handle the musket, to properly go through every evolution properly requires 57 different steps to memorize. And of those, it takes 11 to fire the musket. That's how complex this is. And these are having to be done in a very regularized and a very almost syncopated measure. Otherwise, it's not going to work. This probably took a great deal of time, for the non-coms to be able to teach these men how to do it. The evidence suggests that some men had seen prior service. Some were perhaps familiar with handling a military musket. Some of these other guys may not have been. So they're dealing with a real mixed bag in terms of experience. And then the largest formation is the battalion. A battalion exercise, which basically a battalion forms are the 2 halves of an 18th century regiment. The chapters then in each of those from 4, 5, and 6 describe basically the firings, how to march, the wheelings. Basically what that means, if you have a group of men, how you make a left turn or a right turn and not turn it into just a bunch of guys running all over the place. You know, how do you keep that line solid and straight? And then each time it keeps getting bigger from company size to battalion size. And then the last one is of the service of the guards. And this is probably an interesting one. This has a couple little different things, and it also provides a little insight into Dickinson's mindset. At one level, it's military protocol. You have a camp set up, a bunch of guys are out someplace, and you need to recognize the officers. It's very simple as that. And then how you post guards and how you keep a military encampment secure, keep it immune from attack. But the way he took it was it's also recognition of rank. And from what I can tell in him, he's very conscious of hierarchy. He understands military protocol, and he understands that we are now doing something that is of military nature, and you must obey your officers and you must recognize them. The guy last week might have been your boss plowing the North 40 and you knew each other on a first name basis. That no longer counts. He's now colonel or major or captain. And he really used this chapter to impress upon these men the importance of kind of letting go of the civilian informalities and actually operating in a military style. Dickinson had all of these different components probably put together sometime in the beginning of 1782. The date on the preface is April 15th. So he had it ready to then, and it was at the printer. He printed up about 350 copies of all of this, and he handed out 150 copies to each of the brigades. To make sure that this was working, beginning in May of 1782, he began to send correspondence out to his officers saying that I hope you got the copies of von Steuben's abstract. This is a reference that I found early on. And he began to say, we need to get together and train, and I want to see if this is working. And you let me know the dates. So there's all this back and forth of when they thought the battalion officers could get together. And finally, that all began to happen in October of 1782. And literally through most of October, Mr. Dickinson is actually in the field, and he is personally reviewing each company or battalion in each of the counties. They were still hampered by lack of supplies, lack of ammunition. That would retard some of their activities a little bit. But if you look at October, November of 1782, December even, and compare that to what had happened 10 months earlier, it's a different organization and much more successful. One thing that I like to see in this manual are some of the changes that Mr. Dickinson recommended. He's writing the council while he's doing all this, and I would like to see artillery companies attached. I would like to see this and this. And in 1793, when Delaware gets its first federal constitution, those things actually get incorporated into law. And it's kind of tempting to draw a line from Dickinson's request to that. And it's the first time it actually occurs, that Delawareans actually do it. So I'm kind of tempted to think, yes, they listened to him. It just took a decade, for it to occur. But when the militia reorganized itself in the early republic, many of the things that he envisioned and foresaw actually took place. And that's the pragmatic side of it. But there's also a very idealistic side, that when you look at things that he's writing, and it particularly comes out in his preface in here, of what he expects of his militiamen and his ideal of what it means to be a citizen soldier, and his encouraging to think that you are free men. And that comes with a lot of privileges, but it comes with a lot of responsibilities. You have an obligation to defend your home, to defend your government. And at the same time, it gives some really interesting insight into how he sees military force being used. It's never to be used for personal gain. It's never to be used for conquest. It's always for the defense of the weak and to guard against injustice, as he says here. So at one level, the manual reflects a pragmatic solution to some extraordinarily difficult problems, but it also reflects his idealism that we see in so many other things that Jane has documented in her work, comes out of it in his expression and how he sees what life in the early republic should be all about. And there he is. I think he's quite a military leader. It's an aspect of his life we don't normally think of. And I'm pretty sure this story's not over. We will certainly find new things that provide some clues into what he is doing and how he is helping the Delaware state at the end of the American Revolution. I thank you very much.